Good day, everyone, and welcome back to another webinar organized by Enterprise Big Data Framework Alliance. My name is Jeremy, and I'm the host for this session. For those of you who are new to our webinar sessions, we have allocated some time for Q&A at the end of the sharing session, so feel free to post as many questions as you like by clicking on the Q&A icon on the right-hand side of your screen. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Mr. Babalo. He is a director and principal BI consultant at Kinetic Technologies. He has more than 13 years of experience working in business advisory and technical delivery roles. Over the years, he has developed insights and capabilities in business and data modeling, data quality principles, architectural concepts and patterns, developing and delivering data systems, and he is also a certified trainer for the Enterprise Big Data Framework, which is what we are seeing on the screen. So basically, the Enterprise Big Data Framework provides you with big data practices, and you will see that we have actually 5 certifications for you to choose from. Okay, and you will see that on the screen, the foundation level, which is known as the Enterprise Big Data Professional, that is the foundation level. And based on your choice, you can choose that whether you want to go towards the business track or the technical track, which we have the Enterprise Big Data Analyst, Enterprise Big Data Scientist, Enterprise Big Data Engineer, and Enterprise Big Data Architect. Okay, so for today, Babalo is going to share with us a very interesting topic titled Mastering the Art of Data Storytelling. With that, Babalo, I'll pass the session to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and welcome to everyone who is joining us today for our session. So already been introduced, but just a brief one from my side. So as mentioned by Jeremy, I basically am the director of Kinetic Technologies and also work as a consultant there. And for the most part of my career, the past 13 years, I've been working as a business and technology consultant in advisory and technical roles with a primary focus on data management. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to work on a number of BI products across a number of industries. And I suppose a fun fact, I think one of my highest ideals is to basically teach my mom, who's approaching retirement, and the rest of the family business intelligence. I just think it would make for great dinner conversations. So jumping right into it, so this is our itinerary for the day. We've got quite a bit to cover. So we're going to start with opening thoughts on stories and humans. And most of our presentation today is going to be broken up into ultimately 3 areas, which we're going to look at the essence of what data storytelling is. And then we are going to look at the whole concept of a narrative, looking also at the context, the what, the audience as well, which is the who part of it. And where we're going to spend most of our time today is on the visual data for impact, which is the how, the mechanisms that we utilize to make sure that we communicate effectively with our audience. And at the very end of our session today, we're just going to look at a practical example where we bring everything together as far as how we can build effective data stories utilizing visualizations. So let's jump right into it. So some opening thoughts on stories and humans. So in our journey of evolution, humans developed language and speech as an essential tool for survival. To thrive, we needed to be organized, which in turn required effective communication. And this is what gave rise to the art of storytelling as part of oral traditions. Humans have always been telling stories to make sense of the world around them. And over thousands of years, we have mastered this form of communication. Even before the invention of writing, we're already weaving tales and using visual depictions to encode information. So our storytelling abilities have always been with us, evolving alongside with the tools that we use. As Will Storr states in his book, The Science of Storytelling, Story emerges from human minds as naturally as breath emerges from between human lips. You don't have to be a genius to master it. It's something that we are already doing. We do it on a day-to-day basis. We tell stories. Stories are everywhere. They are part of our public and private conversations. They're part of our thoughts. They're in our news. They're in our phone. They're in our mobile phones. So the human mind is fundamentally designed to process information and understand the world through narratives. And today, what we are going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at how to tell business stories through the lens of data and data visualizations. So what we're going to start with is just understanding what storytelling with data is, why it is important, and what's the ultimate purpose. So change, whether in the business context as far as the plot of our conversation today is, or in the general environment, has always been a formidable force. And it has always been something that has basically needed us to observe and understand how to actually interpret it. So we tell business stories to interpret the changes that we observe in the business environment. So usually there's going to be a trigger. It could be a dashboard, it could be a report, but there is some information that is going to pull through, that is going to notify us of a change that has happened in our environment. And naturally, humans are rationalizing creatures. So whenever we see something that is outside of the normal, whether it is an opportunity or it is a problem, naturally we try to understand and try to make sense of it. And what we ultimately are seeking is insight, which is basically just information that allows us to understand the situation better. Once we get to a point where we have understood or have gotten to our key or major finding on insight, we need to communicate our findings to the people that need to receive this information. And this is where we ultimately use business stories to encode that information. And building a narrative with data is a powerful way to communicate insights, create impact, and influence decisions. Now, as you saw in the image earlier, there's a second part that is utilized with stories, which is the visual aspect. So what we're going to look at now is, at a high level, the science between visual data perception. So nearly 70% of our sensory receptors in the body are in the eye, which basically means that vision dominates our sensory landscape. And as Stephen Few mentioned in his book on information design, dashboard design, is that it is no coincidence that when we understand something, we say, I see, not I hear or I smell. And this is just basically due to the fact that vision is dominant. However, there is more than what actually meets the eye. The visual system has its own rules. Right? So these are perception-based rules, and we are going to touch on those on our session today. So we can easily say patterns presented in certain ways, but if they are presented in other ways, they become invisible to us. So we need to understand perception-based rules so that we can make sure that we are communicating the information that is important and that needs to stand out for our audience. Now that we've gotten a bit of a high level of the two aspects that we're going to be looking at, which is our stories and our data and why they are actually important and powerful ways to actually communicate, we're going to now go on and look at what it is crafting a narrative. How do we actually do it? And a bit of history of where it actually comes from. So we're going to look at the 3-act narrative structure. So narrative is as old as humanity. Its origins are deeply rooted in oral traditions. And just to understand what a narrative, it's an account of events, experiences, or processes that unfold over time. However, it is more than just a sequence of events. It's a structured way of presenting information which has a beginning, a middle, and an end, often featuring elements like setting, characters, conflict, and resolution. Now, this beginning, middle, and end narrative structure, better known as the three-act screenplay, dates back to Aristotle's dramatic theory as outlined in his Poetics as a storytelling model. What it has is also tension. So as the story progresses from beginning to end, there is a rising tension. And how it actually happens is that initially when we are beginning to tell our story, we're going to set context, the current context of the situation, introduce the characters that we utilize, and define the business problem opportunity. And as the story progresses, we introduce conflict or the challenge, right, in our story. And gradually, as we are uncovering our data, we have what is rising insights, which is basically the progressing detail as we go deeper into our analysis and start to discover insights on our problem or opportunity within our business context, our business problem. And the very height of it, the climax, is where we get our central insight or major finding, and following that, we have the solution and next step, which moves us towards the end of our story. Now, once we communicate data in this way, it actually helps to enrich the audience's knowledge and increases the likelihood that we can inspire action. Now, to look at this, we're going to look at a fictitious scenario of a company that is an e-commerce company called ABC Limited, just to understand how to actually structure a narrative. So we're going to start by setting the context. So ABC Limited has been having consistent growth in sales in the past 5 years. Sales has been declining, however, in the last 2 quarters, which is where the alarm bell has actually rung. And contrary to that, we're seeing that website traffic has increased by 15%. As part of our context, this is the audience that we are going to be telling our story to, which is senior leadership and the sales team. And now we need to introduce our characters, the data points. Now, what the data points do is that they highlight that there is a problem, but they do not uncover the why, which is what now needs to be done by the team who is responsible to understand the situation. So here's an example in our scenario of the measures that we're looking at. Number of website visitors mentioned has gone up by 15%. Sales conversion has dropped. We are seeing that our return rate has increased by 20%. For some reason, our customers are returning our products. And when we ran a survey, we have noted that there is a lot of complaints around our checkout process. And this now takes us to our conflict, right, in our story. So, which is that despite the increase in web traffic, sales are dropping because of a declining conversion rate. Now, as rising insights, our data also indicates that our main demographic, which is millennials, is most affected, right? And they're going to social media and they're giving negative reviews, which is also damaging the brand's reputation. And then we proceed now to introduce our eureka moment, our central insight, and which is that our checkout page is outdated and slow, has unnecessary step, and isn't mobile friendly. And as a result, our customers are abandoning their carts before they actually check out. And following that, now we need to introduce a solution or potential solution. And in this case, the development team at ABC Limited proposes a full design of the checkout page. And ultimately, what you're seeing here is a narrative following the 3-act structure. Now, next, what we are going to look at is context, the what of our communication. Now, what we always need to remember is that we need our audience to know or do something, right? However, I had a bit of a challenge when I was introduced to the theory of storytelling with data, in that a story is told in stages, in sequences, in acts, and you're going from one to the second to the third until you get to your eureka moment and then propose a solution. However, dashboards present a unique challenge for data storytelling. Now, dashboards involve monitoring necessary information to achieve business goals, But this all has to be consolidated and organized into a single screen for quick and easy monitoring, which is quite different to how you would present static information. Data in dashboards is live, it's changing on a daily basis. So therefore, there are different design patterns that have to be utilized. However, most of what we're going to learn, all of what we're going to learn can be applied here. So what are the key differences? So the key differences is the responsibility of interpretation. So in a dashboard, the users or the person who's going to be consuming the dashboards are the ones that are responsible for interpretation. So ours is to let them know, and we have to design our visuals in a sense that it guides them through to what we need them to know. And secondly, then what becomes a key differentiator is the presentation format, which is quite the obvious part. You've got one screen where you have to be able to quickly see everything at a glance, as opposed to telling a story in a structured way. So then what is context? So when we look at dashboard, what could be the context? So the context in the dashboard could be raw, strategic, or analytical. You would design and build your communication differently depending on that. It would be the domain, of course. Who are you building it for? It could be the purpose and framework. Are you building performance measures? Are you building predictive or comparative measures? And of course, the scope. Is it at the enterprise level? Is it at department level? And ultimately, because we're dealing with live data, we want to understand what would be the update frequencies on a monthly or weekly or daily basis. Now, looking at our story, to touch back on what we mentioned on your audience, what they need to know. So what would it be that we are communicating, we want our audience to know in our situation? And it would be that our poorly designed checkout process is causing sales to decline. And if nothing is done, it is going to continue to hurt revenues and the reputation of the company. And then we follow with what we need the audience to do. And based on the data, the team is recommending that we completely redesign the checkout process. And the ultimate objective is to address the root cause of this issue and regain lost sales and enhance customer satisfaction. Right. Now, before we move on to the next topic, when it comes to context, there are two kinds of context that you need to be aware of. One is the narrative context, which is basically what we had a chat about, which is the broader story you are telling with your data. The key elements of that being the objective of the story, background information, key message, flow, and structure, right? So it generally frames and helps the audience to understand the relevance of the data. Another context that is equally important is visualization context, right? And this is the specific context provided within each data visualization to make it easily interpretable. So we're looking at access labels and scales, as an example, legends, annotations, data labels. This makes it easier for the people who are looking at the data visualization to understand what it is that is ultimately being communicated. Now that we have touched on that, I think that the next important part now that we understand is the audience, the who part of our communication. So Cole Nackliff says it quite succinctly and clearly that the story is not for you. And this is key for us to understand, that you are communicating for your audience. In design thinking, the leading principle or mode is empathize. This is the work that you do to understand people within the scope of your design challenge. In our context, right, this would be the work you do to understand the people who need to act based on the information that you have presented, which is ultimately your audience. There are a number of tools that you can utilize to facilitate this and assist you. So we're just going to share a few here. So interviews, which is the most direct way you can get to understand your audience, sitting down with them, preparing for the interviews. Number of best practices that need to be followed here. To share one, it is good practice to have an interview with two people, one being a scribe and the one being the interviewer. It just makes sure that you capture all of the information that is required by focusing on one area. Another example is that if you can record after communicating, of course, with the person that you're interviewing and they're okay with that, you can record the interview, which would allow you, for instance, to be able to go back to the discussion and review it again. Another way you could also get to understand your audience is using question as an example. So sometimes your stakeholders or the audience might not have the time to actually sit down with you, and you can put together an email with a set of questions that you need them to help you to better understand their requirements and their needs. And then I think the last way you could look at it, which is less direct, is user personas, which is you craft a persona based on a role. If your audience is the leadership team, understanding what their goals are, the objectives are. If it is senior management, you would look at different personas and they would have different goals. And you can use this ultimately to assist you in crafting your narrative and your data story. And a general rule, you want to avoid general audiences. This could mean that you have to craft different communications for different audiences. This is okay. This is okay, because ultimately what we need is we need our audience to understand the information from their perspective, and therefore we might need to tailor our communication for our different audiences. But generally, you want to avoid broad and general audiences. Now, we are going to move on to the next part, which is where we're going to spend most of our day today, and which is the how part, the mechanisms, the principles, and the coding rules. But before we start that, let's just start with a bit of an exercise that looks at the limits of memory. So if I were to give you this image and ask you to count the number of threes that you see there, and I'm going to give you a few seconds to look at it. Now, what you are probably going to notice is that if I pull the second picture and ask you to do the same thing, it is going to be much easier for you to count the number of threes on the second image. Why? The image above requires attentive processes, right? When you are attentive, you have to use sequential processing, which is much slower in your intake of data. Whereas in the second image, we use pre-attentive attributes. In this case, the color intensity, which makes it easier for us to spot and count the threes. Only a portion of what our eyes sense becomes an object of our focus. And what we're going to look at now, in turn, is just look at a memory model on how memory works. So ultimately, you've got your sensory input that comes in. And in this case, we're looking at iconic memory, which is visual, which is our visual sensory register. Now, this happens outside of consciousness, so it's pre-conscious processing. And it moves from iconic memory to short-term memory, and short-term memory is also referred to as working memory. And from there, it moves to long-term memory, consolidated and moved to long-term memory, and then retrieved as required. Now, what is important to understand is that there's a time limit. So in iconic memory, you've got a few seconds before literally information is lost. And in short-term memory, you work within the bounds of minutes. And of course, in long-term memory, it's more of a lifetime. Now, in order to be able to transfer information from the iconic memory into short-term memory, attention is required. All right. And we mentioned pre-attentive attributes, and this is where pre-attentive processing happens. It happens in the iconic memory, and all it is ultimately is the early stage of visual perception that rapidly occurs below the level of consciousness. It is tuned to detect specific set of visual attributes, right? Which we are going to look at in following slides. And then after we go into the short-term memory, right? And there are a couple of things that you need to also understand pertaining to short-term memory, right? Outside of it operating within the span of minutes. One, it is temporary, right? portion is dedicated to visual information. And of course, as you can see, that there's limited storage as well. So there is the concept of chunks, right? So we can store around 3 to 9 chunks of visual information at a time in short-term memory. And what a chunk is in the context of memory and data visualization is a meaningful unit of information. So it is a grouping. So the key to chunking then is grouping information in ways that are easily recognizable. And this assists to reduce cognitive load. And this is the one great advantage that graphs have over text, right? Okay, so what we're looking at here is ultimately the visual encoding. So I'm just going to start from the top again. So we've got color, we've got hue, which is ultimately color, so green, yellow, blue, right? And we've got intensity, which speaks to the full essence of the color that is being utilized and usually measured as a percentage from 0 to 100. And then what we have is position or 2D location. This pre-attentive attribute is the primary means of encoding quantitative data in graphs. So when we look at form, we look at line length. Line length up there is also very useful as far as quantitative encoding of data, as it is very easy for us to perceive the difference in size between line length. Line width, used for emphasis. Size, again, you'll see this used in scatter plots when they are converted into bubble charts to add or encode with an additional dimension of data. And then, of course, we've got orientation and enclosure. So enclosure, as I mentioned, very powerful form of encoding data. You will see it as well in the Gestalt principles as well, shapes and marks. Now, as far as quantitative relevance, so the hue, not very useful when it comes to encoding quantitative data. Intensity, yes, but it's limited. 2D location, as mentioned, right up there. This is very good for us for quantitative data. You'd see this being used a lot in line grams when you add markers as an example, and also in scatter plots. And when we look at line length, very good for quantitative encoding. The rest, which is line length and size, are limited. They can be used, but they are limited. And then the rest are not very useful when it comes to encoding quantitative data. So what we're going to go now to next is the Gestalt principles of visualization. So for a bit of history, so in 1912, the Gestalt School of Psychology started studying how we see patterns, forms, and organization. And the German term Gestalt, I hope I'm pronouncing it properly, basically just means pattern. So it is basically pattern principles of visual perception. The work resulted in a collection of Gestalt principles of perception that reveal those visual characteristics that incline us to group objects together. And we're going to look at those now. So the first one being proximity. So elements that are close to each other are perceived as a group or related. Closure. So the brain tends to complete incomplete shapes if we can see a square or a circle or whatever visual that we think should look like what we are perceiving. Similarity. Objects that look similar are perceived as being part of the same group. Continuity. The eye is drawn along paths, lines, or curves. So whatever we see as a smooth line or a path, we generally assume that it's part of one group. And again, there we see enclosure, as mentioned prior. Very powerful way of encoding data as well. So elements that are enclosed in a bunch are perceived as part of one group. And then connection. So objects that are connected in some way, like in our example, they're using a line, are perceived to be in one group. And then symmetry. So the mind actually loves simplicity and symmetry, so order. So that works very well as well for us to quickly be able to group our data. But there is an order of strength as well, right? So the perception of grouping that is provided by connection is the strongest. It is only weaker than that produced by enclosure, as you see in our example here, right? So now we're gonna dive into the visualizations themselves, right? And look at visualizations from a perspective of category, look at them from a perspective of dimensions, and then we will end by looking at form and function. So as far as visualization and category is concerned, there are two fundamental visualization categories, which is verbal and visualizations or graphics. So anything that you need to read is falls under verbal text. So tables, simple KPIs, as an example, you have to read this. And verbal language is processed serially, so it does not take advantage of pre-attentive processing, but it has certain uses. For instance, if you have to look up data, looking it up in a table is the best way, right? And then we have graphic visualizations. Of course, this ultimately then takes advantage of all these pre-attentive attributes, and it helps us to also see the shape and pattern of data. So ultimately, verbal visualizations, if you want to look at precise details of the data, but if you're interested more in looking at relationship trends and patterns, then graphics are the way to go, right? Now, charts themselves are further divided into dimensions, right? So you've got one-dimensional plots, which basically present data that varies along a single dimension or axis. They are typically used to show changes in a single variable or display distribution of values, so line graphs, histograms, and bar graphs. And when we look at best practices for visual encoding in one-dimensional plots, position is quite up there. And then we've got length as well, which we know those two are very powerful forms of encoding quantitative data. We can use color to highlight specific data points. And then, of course, the line type, whether it's a dash or a solid line, can be used as well as a way of encoding your data. And then we've got two-dimensional types, two-dimensional plots that represent data that varies along two dimensions or axes. And an example of such charts are scatter plots, your heat maps. And again, they take advantage of position as well as a pre-attentive attribute. They use color. So in scatter plots, for instance, when you introduce color, you can introduce a third dimension. And of course, size, as we mentioned earlier, for bubble charts. And ultimately, we can use different shapes. So in a scatter plot, you can either use squares or triangles, and that could be used to encode your data, right? But if you're telling your story as well, you have to understand what kind of function, how do you want the data to be understood? What are you doing? Are you comparing data? Are you looking at trends? Are you looking at distribution? Now, depending on what it is that you want to communicate and what you want to basically analyze, you would use different types of visualization. So this might not be exhaustive, but generally, these are the functions that we mostly deal with. So distribution, you have histogram and box plots, which are excellent for that. If you need to rank data, a bar chart ordered in ascending or descending order, depending on what you want to do, is quite excellent. Looking at comparison bar charts, bullet charts, excellent visuals for doing that. And again, now relationships, we're looking at your 2D plots, scatter plots are excellent. If your data is geographically relevant, then you need a visualization that uses a map, like a coral path map, or one that uses symbols. For outline detection, scatter plots are excellent. You can also use histograms and box plots as well. And part to whole stacked bar charts, and this is where the infamous pie chart would also exist. And yeah, I've got my opinions on the pie chart. I've seen it in situations where it's quite useful, but of course, from a data visualization perspective, best practices, you want to actually stay away from it. However, it depends on what you want to communicate. So there's always a degree of flexibility. And then we want to look at trends. We've got a line chart as an example, right? A further aspect to consider is categorical scales. So there are ultimately three categorical scales that we need to understand when it comes to communicating our data and which visuals to use to represent it. We've got nominal scales, which consist of discrete items that belong to a common category, but have no specific relationship to each other. And a bar graph works excellently for this. An example would be sales by department or sales by region. So department and region is basically a discrete item, right? And what we have next are ordinal scales. So ordinal scales have a specific order, but they do not correspond to any specific quantitative value. So A, B, C, small, medium, large. And again, bar graphs are the best way to actually attend to this kind of communication. And then lastly, we've got interval scales, right? So interval scales begin as quantitative scales and are later transformed into categorical scales by dividing the range of the values into a series of smaller and equally sized ranges. So for instance, when you do binning or grouping, right, in bar charts, as an example. And the best form of visual encoding for this is to actually use a line graph, right? So you do not want to use a line graph for ordinal or nominal scales. You use a bar graph for that, and for interval scales, you want to look at something like a line graph, right? And another important aspect is to speak of function and form in data storytelling. So function speaks to the utility and the purpose of the visualization, so how should it be used, right? And form relates to how the data is presented visually, so the aesthetic part of it. There are key considerations for each that we're gonna in turn just look at. For instance, when we speak about function, accuracy, right, is a key consideration, and this is also where we talk about now about ethics, making sure that the information that you are communicating is accurate, has integrity, as your information can affect directly or indirectly other individuals or humans, right? So we have to make sure that our information is accurate. We make sure that it is readable, easy to read, and of course, it must be fit for purpose. So we look at relevance. And key considerations from a perspective of form, we need clarity. So this speaks to concepts like data to ink ratio, where we do not want our visuals to be cluttered, they must be clear. And then we also talk about consistency. They must be visually consistent across. So this is where we need to have standards. And in some instances in organizations, you have themes that are built and utilized. And then of course the aesthetic part, it assists for visualizations to actually look visually appealing as far as communication is concerned. Now we're gonna in turn look at this from a perspective of accessibility, which is also a key consideration as far as your communication is concerned, to make sure that a wider audience can be able to understand and reach your information that you're sharing. So one consideration is keyboard navigation and screen readers. You want to include interactivity that is accessible. So people that are using keyboards and cannot use a mouse must be able to access your information, as an example. And you also want to add alternative text or descriptive elements. These are examples of considerations to make sure that you do not exclude any people from accessing the information or the communication that you're putting forward. When it comes to form, visual cues, you want to make sure that you don't heavily rely on color to convey information, because there are people who have got color vision impairments. So, and you want to make sure that you also use accessible color palettes for your visuals. And then font and text, use legible fonts that everyone can use, simple fonts. And again, the rule is always keeping it simple and sticking with the familiar. So we have come to the end of this portion of our presentation. What we're going to look at now, before we get into the practical side of things, is just data abstraction, which is the process of transforming raw information into visually comprehensible representations. And there is a process that is followed to basically remove the complexity from our data sets. One, you start by understanding the structures, variables, and relationship within your data, right? And you look at the data cleaning and pre-processing. This is now the accuracy and integrity part of your data that you want to make sure that you have cleaned up your data and it's ready for analysis. Then you need to identify the key variables and metrics for your communication within your data sets, and then determine the level of abstraction. And this will depend on the intended audience that you're going to be sharing your communication with. And then you need to select your summary techniques to distill the essence of your data while maintaining the core insights. There are a number of techniques you can use, for instance, sum, average, etc. These are summary techniques that you can use for your data. And then, of course, we do a bit of wizardry with visual encoding. And what you need to also understand is that this is going to be an iterative process. There's always going to be continued refinement to make sure that we're becoming more clear, more accurate, more effective. So ultimately, abstracting data involves just condensing complex data sets into concise and meaningful summaries. And that brings us to the end of our theoretical part. So what we're going to look at now is examples of us using all those principles that we have talked about. So we've got a scenario that we're going to look at. So our scenario is we have got IT attrition that we are tracking in the organization. We want to understand it by department over time. Right. So I've used Power BI to create these visualizations, and what I've done is I've used as an example one of the accessibility themes, that have more natural colors that are utilized to make sure that everyone who sees the communication, whether they have visual impairments, can be able to see the different color hues. Now, the first problem we have here is that we understand that we want to see the data over time, and our axis is the department, and we want to start as a best practice by designing from a grayscale. So in the next visual, we make a few rectifications. We push back the colors with grayscale. We change the axis, so we have time as our x-axis. But now we understand that we're looking at IT data. So we're going to isolate our data to make sure that we're just looking at the data that relates to IT. Now, our objective was to see a trend across time. And although we can see comparative bars, we cannot exactly see a definitive trend. So perhaps this is not the best visualization for what we're trying to achieve. So then we change it ultimately to a trend, a line graph. And immediately we can see, okay, now we have got the flow and continuity in the line. And we've also encoded IT so that we can see the data that relates to the department of our interest. But we're not finished. What we're going to do now is to make sure that we remove a bit of clutter from the visualization that we have here, right? And this is going to talk to the concept of data to ink ratio, which is a concept that was introduced by Edward Tafter in a book that he wrote in 1983, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And the ultimate goal of this concept is to minimize non-essential elements in a chart or graph, therefore enhancing the clarity and focus on the data itself. Right. So the first thing we do is we sort of make sure that our data is in the correct order as far as ascending from 2018 to 2022. And then what we're going to start doing now is pushing back all the elements that we do not need. I've removed the X's because it's quite intuitive. I've also removed the Y label because in our title already, we know that we're looking at employee turnover rate, right? And I love curved lines, so this is just a preference. And though what we've also done is added marks, right? Using now those visual encoding principles with just lengths of 2D locations, which makes it easier for our audience to be able to see the data. What we go further and do now is that we add more descriptions as far as our title. We change our title. We add additional context using a subtitle, right? And additionally, we've added data labels into our data. So we know that we're looking at IT. We understand exactly the data points that they've utilized. And you'll also notice that we've pushed back the grid lines. I've not completely removed them because I find that they can be useful at times as far as reading data. And there are many ways you can actually encode this data. For instance, just to show you an example, small multiples is a very good way to see patterns across different variables, right? So yeah, this then becomes our final visualization. And what we're going to look at next in closing is to tell a bit of a story concerning our company, right? And this story relates to IT attrition. So the IT and HR department have got a dashboard that they track together. And this is the dashboard that we have. And when we look at this dashboard, there are a couple of alarms that are ringing. So we look at the cost of attrition, we look at the IT headcount, which is important to our organization. And following that, we follow sort of like if you are English speaking, you sort of read from left to right. And we take advantage of that so that when the users are reading, they read at the very top, and then they come down in a Z form, coming to the visual, and that should proceed to the next visual, understanding who the employees are, what the average employee is, and then the average, sort of the main reasons for leaving. And what we have found is that we have got a conflict, which is high turnover is costing the company, not just on recruitment costs, but training expenses as well. It has a negative impact, right? And by looking at our data, we are making assumptions that high levels of burnout, which could be due to excessive workloads and unclear career progression paths. And we've got a number of recommendations that we have, but now we need to communicate this in a visual way, by also communicating using a story to explain our situation in a wider audience. So let's start with our story. So our objective for our story is to understand the changes in attrition over time and the factors influencing it. And ultimately, we want to use the information to shape a strategy to sort of remediate the situation and also make sure that we keep our employees. So when we start our story in 2018 and 2019, where the marketing and sales team has got basically 8 and 10% attrition rate, so they were losing a lot of people. Contrast to that, the IT department had a very low attrition rate. However, by 2022, the average employee turnover in IT had increased by 200% to a record 9%, right? And next, what we want to introduce now is, okay, this is the challenge that we're seeing, but why? What is actually happening here? And when we've done further analysis, we've come to understand that in 2019, when the sales and marketing had high employee dissatisfaction and attrition, there was a project that was implemented, which was Project Athena. Project Athena was a huge success, as we see in our visuals. Marketing and sales dropped below the company average of 6%. Unfortunately, this had a reverse impact on IT attrition. And we have used annotations in this visual to further encode the information, noting that when we're 3%, this is when Project Athena was launched. And then we went to an all-time high of 9%, and we see a drop. And the reason we saw a drop is that the IT department introduced flexible working hours as an IT project, but it was for a short-term period, which was 12 months. So we've basically been operating above the company average. Now, we extend this now out with more rising insights. Compared to the organization, we have had a tenure of an average of 2%, which is below the average of the company. And then when we look at the company data, we're realizing that 77% of the reasons for people leaving are related to unbearable work demands. And therefore now we proceed to present a solution, which is, in our case, policy changes and support programs. Our recommendation, as mentioned earlier, reviewing workload distribution, implementing programs that are going to assist with mentorship and coaching, and then introducing flexible work hours as a company policy. And the ultimate objective that we want to reach is to improve job satisfaction and reduce employee turnover. And that brings us to the end of our session today. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Babalo, for this sharing session. I personally find it extremely useful, and I believe that the listeners share the same opinion as well. It is important to know how to analyze data, and also it is equally important to know how you can communicate those insights with the data. So I think you have perfectly covered all of the topics earlier. So now we'll move into the Q&A session. Let me check if we have any questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 4 questions, which I will go with the first one first. So the first question, are there best practices for using animation in data visualization, or are there risks to be aware of?
I think a general rule is simplicity. So are the animations adding anything to the communication, right? So if it is just to make it look fancy but does not contribute to the communication itself, then I'd say remove them. So as a general rule, always say simplicity and try to use visualizations that people are familiar with. So everyone has sort of seen a bar graph, and it's easy to understand if we look at the visual encoding principle as well. So keep it simple. There's nothing ultimately wrong with using animation as long as it supports the message that you are driving, and everyone who's going to be looking at it will understand it easily.
Nice. Thank you for that, Babalo. Then we have the second question. How do you design for accessibility in data visualization, for example, color blindness, and what impact does this have on the overall storytelling approach?
So it is to make sure that you include everyone. So I think the statistics are that around about 10% of the population has got visual impairment. So it's to make sure that everyone can access your data. Now, depending on what tool you utilize. So for instance, I use Power BI quite a lot. So there are a lot of features that are built into these tools that assist you with accessibility. There are also a number of websites as well that are available out there that would assist you in understanding if the colors that you've used in your visuals are the colors that everyone can be able to see, right? So by using the tools that are available in the software, the features that are available in the software tools, you can build in accessibility. And further to that, there are a number of websites where you can just double check if the colors that you utilize would reach everyone as far as being able to interpret and see what is being presented.
Thank you for that. And then we have the third question. Are there specific tools or platforms you recommend for creating compelling visual stories? Any recommendations?
So look, there are many tools you can use. I use Power BI a lot, right? So this is my de facto tool, but there are many other tools like Tableau that you can utilize. Also, from a design perspective, I think the one thing that is a bit of a deviation from a world of BI, which I always say that was technology driven and was missing in methodology, is to start using design tools like Adobe Illustrator as an example, right? So you to just design your wireframes. You can do it in PowerPoint as well, but the whole idea is to design before you actually develop. So there is also a number of softwares that are available to create your mockups or wireframes from a dashboarding perspective. But generally, if you are presenting static information, I think you always go okay with something like PowerPoint to present your data, depending on which one you prefer.
Okay, thank you for that. Then the fourth question, what are some common mistakes in dashboard design that weaken their storytelling potential?
Dashboards. There's quite a lot. I think the one thing that I've noted over the years as a mistake in dashboard is trying to over clutter the image. So what we do is we try to create one page in the report that is gonna answer sales, that's gonna answer HR, that's gonna answer logistics, and that does not work very well. So again, avoid general audiences. Make sure that each page in the dashboard that you develop or create speaks to a specific audience. And this is at the risk that you might have to create multiple visualizations and create multiple stories for different audiences, and that is fine, because ultimately our objective is to make sure that our audience and our users are able to comprehend what we're trying to communicate. They know what needs to be known, and they can follow through with actions to make sure that they achieve their set objectives in the organization.
Thanks for that. That's very good advice, actually. Then the last question we have for you is, How do you adapt your data narrative to different stakeholders with varying levels of data literacy? Yeah, a good question.
An excellent one. So data literacy is tricky. It's quite a bit of a problem. So I think you sort of lead with education to a certain extent. So if your audience is completely data illiterate, right, I think it is important then that you lead with basics of data literacy. And I think you'd see there's been quite a drive ultimately around the data literacy and making sure that people understand data. So education is what you lead with. And then secondly, I would say, to make sure that you make your visualization as simple as possible. One-dimensional plots, for instance, are quite easy to interpret. Take advantage of those visual encodings. Make sure that you utilize that quite a lot, because most of us, even if we are not data literate per se, when we look at visualizations that make use of those pre-attentive attributes, our eyes are quickly directed to what we need to see there. So, but education is key to make sure that your audience understands how to interpret the data. If you recognize that there is a gap, then I think you'd have to lead with making sure that you empower your audience first, and then follow through by making sure you execute using the principles for visual perception.
Okay, thank you so much. So with that, Babaloh, we will close our session today. Once again, thank you for joining, and I hope to see you again in our future events.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone who has joined today. Sorry, please continue.
I just want to thank all of you that have joined this session as well. And just make sure that you subscribe to our channel, and we will have more future events for you. Thank you.